They thought they had buried me, forgotten me, erased me. For 14 years, I had been nothing more than a shadow in their past, a mistake they had cast out without a second thought. To them, I had disappeared, vanished into the void, just another discarded inconvenience. But tonight, I walked through those gilded doors, not as the helpless girl they had thrown away, but as the reckoning they never saw coming. And as I stood in the heart of their perfect, polished world, watching their carefully constructed lives begin to crack, I smiled. Because they had no idea what was coming. I stepped into the grand ballroom, my heels clicking against the polished marble floor. The air was thick with wealth, the kind that dripped from crystal chandeliers and gleamed in the gold-trimmed decor. Every detail screamed opulence, the silk tablecloths, the murmured laughter of guests draped in designer gowns, the faint clinking of champagne flutes raised in toasts. It was the kind of place where people like me weren't meant to exist. And yet here I was. The moment I crossed the threshold, the reaction was immediate. A ripple of discomfort spread through the crowd. Eyes flickered toward me, some filled with curiosity, others with irritation. But it was my family's response that made the moment worth it. At the center of the room, surrounded by guests, my mother froze mid-sip of her champagne. Her lips curled, distaste flashing across her sharp features. "What is that useless girl doing here?" she hissed, loud enough for those around her to hear. Elle, my younger sister, the golden child, the one who had taken everything without ever having to fight for it, turned slowly. She crossed her arms over her designer wedding gown, her expression a practiced mask of control. But the subtle twitch at the corner of her mouth betrayed her irritation. "You're not on the guest list," she said flatly. I smiled. I hadn't expected a warm welcome. I had been nothing to them for the past 14 years. A discarded burden. An inconvenience. And yet, here they were, acting as though my mere presence was a stain on their perfect, polished world. Then, Ron, Elle's fiancé, stepped forward. Tall, confident, smug, until his eyes landed on me. His breath hitched, his body tensed. Recognition. Fear. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The color drained from his face. I took a slow step forward, relishing the unease settling over the room. "Do you really not know anything?" I murmured. Elle frowned, glancing between Ron and me. The tension in the room was thick enough to suffocate. They thought they had buried me, forgotten me. But tonight, in this grand display of wealth and status, I had returned. And they had no idea what was coming. The night they threw me out was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, turning every breath into a sharp, aching reminder that I had nowhere to go. My fingers trembled as I clutched the thin jacket wrapped around me, my suitcase, a cheap, worn thing, sitting by my feet on the doorstep of the only home I had ever known. But the door behind me had already shut. No goodbye. No hesitation. Just the finality of that wooden door clicking into place, sealing me out of their lives as if I had never existed. My father's words still rang in my ears. "You're an adult. Figure it out." His voice had been devoid of warmth, not even the slightest trace of regret. Beside him, my mother had merely turned away, not even granting me the dignity of eye contact. I wasn't her daughter anymore. I was a problem solved, a burden lifted. And Elle had been smiling. Smirking really. The same self-satisfied expression she always wore when she got exactly what she wanted. "Guess you're finally out of our lives," she had said, her voice thick with amusement. "Good luck surviving without us." She hadn't expected me to survive at all. I walked for hours that night. The streets blurred past me, unfamiliar and unwelcoming. Every step I took felt heavier, every breath harder. By the time exhaustion forced me to stop, my legs ached, and my hands were numb. I ended up behind a small diner on the edge of town, drawn by the warmth escaping from the kitchen vents. The scent of grease and bread filled the night air, making my stomach twist painfully. I hadn't eaten since that morning, and hunger clawed at my insides. I crouched near the dumpster, curling into myself, trying to find even a sliver of warmth. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, a shadow loomed over me. You planning to die back here? Or are you just bad at picking places to sleep? My eyes snapped open to see a middle-aged woman standing above me. She had sharp eyes, a thick winter coat, and a cigarette dangling from her lips. I scrambled to my feet, my heart hammering. I'm sorry. I'll leave. She exhaled a puff of smoke, eyeing me for a long moment. Then, instead of telling me to get lost, she flicked the cigarette onto the pavement and gestured toward the back door. If you're gonna loiter, might as well make yourself useful. I blinked. What? She crossed her arms. Inside, there's a mop and a bucket. You clean, you eat. Deal? I didn't hesitate. Deal. That night, I mopped floors until my arms burned, but I didn't care. Because for the first time since being thrown away, I had something, no matter how small, to hold on to. Rita, the diner's owner, was gruff, impatient, and always smelled like coffee and cigarettes. But she let me sleep in the storage room that night, and by the end of the week, she was paying me under the table. By the end of the month, I had saved enough for a cheap motel room. And every single night, as I wiped down tables and cleared dirty dishes, I repeated the same promise to myself. One day, I'll make them regret this. One day, they'll wish they had never turned their backs on me. The years that followed were brutal. Every penny I made at the diner went straight into survival, food, rent, the occasional secondhand textbook. I worked until my feet ached, my hands raw from scrubbing counters and mopping floors. But I never complained, because I knew this wasn't my ending. It was just the beginning. One job turned into two, then three. I worked morning shifts at the diner, cleaned offices at night, and spent weekends taking shifts at a local grocery store. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. Every extra dollar went into savings, because I had a plan. At 19, I enrolled in community college, scraping by with whatever financial aid I could find. I studied on my breaks, wrote essays on napkins when I ran out of paper, and devoured every business book I could get my hands on. The day I won a scholarship to a top-tier business school, I stood in the empty diner's kitchen and let myself cry, just for a moment. Then I got to work. By 23, I had my first internship at a rising startup. I was the first one in and the last to leave. I asked questions, studied every decision the executives made, learned the language of power and influence. While my coworkers took lunch breaks, I stayed at my desk, running projections and studying market trends. I had nothing to fall back on. No safety net. So failure was never an option. By 27, I launched my own company, a medical nutrition brand designed to disrupt an industry bloated with overpriced, ineffective products. I had spent years studying the flaws in the system, identifying gaps, and learning how to navigate the complexities of business. I didn't have my family's wealth or connections, but I had something better. I had knowledge, and I knew how to use it. The first year was brutal. Competitors tried to crush me before I gained traction. Investors laughed in my face, but I kept pushing. By the second year, my products were being stocked in major retailers. By the third, we were an industry name. By the fourth, we were dominating the market, a multi-million-dollar empire, built from nothing. And my family? They had no idea. I never reached out. They didn't deserve to know. But I watched. Elle basked in the illusion of perfection, climbing the social ladder, flaunting a life built on privilege she never earned. My parents still operated their family-run clinic, their reputation pristine, on the surface. But beneath that polished exterior, cracks were forming. I knew about the insurance fraud, the falsified patient records, the money laundering. I collected every detail, never rushing, never striking too soon. Because I had learned something far more valuable than business strategies or financial management. I had learned patience. And if I ever saw them again, I would make sure I was standing tall. No longer the unwanted, discarded girl they left behind, but the woman they never saw coming. The room had already begun to shift the moment I walked in, but it wasn't until I stepped forward that the cracks truly began to show. Elle's lips curled into a smirk, the same condescending sneer she had perfected since childhood. She looked me up and down, her arms crossed, her perfectly manicured nails tapping impatiently against her forearm. "You're not on the guest list," she said flatly, her voice carrying across the room, drawing attention. I smiled, slow, deliberate. "Oh, but I was invited." A flicker of confusion crossed her face before she covered it with another practiced scoff. "By who? No one here wants you." That was the thing about Elle. She had spent her entire life believing she could dictate who mattered and who didn't. That her approval was the only validation anyone could need. She still thought I was that girl, desperate for a place in her world. I wasn't, and I was about to prove it. Ron, who had been silent until now, suddenly shifted beside her. He had been watching me from the moment I walked in, his brow furrowed, his jaw tight. The color had drained from his face. Recognition. And then, fear. He took a step toward me, his voice uneven. "Wait, this woman is..." I tilted my head, letting the tension stretch just a little longer before I spoke. "Do you really not know anything?" His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. Elle frowned, looking between us. "What the hell is going on?" she snapped. I took another step forward, my heels clicking against the marble floor, my sleek black gown flowing effortlessly with each movement. I didn't rush. I let the weight of the moment sink in. "I have to say," I murmured, letting my gaze sweep across the room, "I expected better from you, Elle."
She scoffed.
"Oh, please." A bitter laugh escaped her lips as she tossed her hair over her shoulder. "You walk in here, dressed up like you belong, but you're still the same pathetic mess you were when we threw you out." The words were meant to sting. But I had shed the weight of their cruelty years ago. I simply smiled. "Is that what you tell yourself?" I asked, my voice smooth, unbothered. "That I never amounted to anything?" She rolled her eyes. "You didn't. You barely made it through high school. You couldn't even get through college." I arched a brow. "Oh." Elle smirked, completely sure of herself. "What, are you going to tell me you're some big success now?"
"Please."
"Unlike you, I actually did something with my life." I exhaled, shaking my head slightly. "That's funny," I mused, "because I distinctly remember you never graduating medical school." The room went completely still. A murmur rippled through the guests, whispers barely concealed behind manicured hands. Elle's expression faltered, just for a second, but I caught it. Then she laughed loud, dismissive. "Are you serious?" she scoffed. "You're lying. I went to medical school. I'm a doctor." I reached into my clutch, pulling out a neatly folded document. "Are you?" I asked, unfolding the paper with deliberate care. "Because according to your academic records, you flunked out years ago." Elle's smirk disappeared. The wedding guests leaned in, their interest fully peaked now. Ron took a step closer, his brow furrowing as he stared at the paper in my hands. "What is this?" His voice was tight, controlled. Elle stiffened. "It's fake," she said quickly. Too quickly. "She's making it up." I lifted the document slightly, tilting it toward Ron. "Feel free to take a look," I said smoothly. He hesitated, but his hands twitched at his sides. He wanted to believe her, but doubt had already begun creeping in. Elle turned to him, her expression shifting, softening. "Ron, baby, you're not actually listening to her, are you?" she cooed, reaching for his arm.
"She's always been like this."
Twisting things, trying to make herself seem important. Gaslighting. I had seen her do it 100 times before. Ron, however, didn't pull away from her touch. But he didn't look convinced either. I took another step forward, lowering my voice just enough so only she could hear me. "I wonder what else you've been lying about." Elle's grip on Ron's arm tightened. The panic in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. A sharp silence settled over the ballroom, the kind that weighed heavy and suffocating. Elle stood frozen, her mask of arrogance beginning to crack. But I wasn't done. Not even close. I turned my gaze toward my parents, taking my time, letting the tension stretch like a taut wire. My father stood rigid, his jaw clenched, but I could see it. The flicker of unease in his eyes, the slight twitch of his fingers. My mother, ever composed, ever calculating, remained still, but I knew her well enough to recognize the tightness in her posture, the way her fingers curled around her champagne flute just a little too tightly. I tilted my head slightly, letting my smirk widen. "You should have been more careful, Dad," I said, my voice calm, almost amused. He went pale. Elle, still reeling from the revelation about her non-existent medical degree, whipped her head toward him. "What is she talking about?" she demanded. I took another slow step forward, reveling in the way the crowd had gone deathly quiet. The wedding guests, once engaged in polite chatter and laughter, now stood transfixed, their gazes darting between me and my family. "You thought you could get away with it," I continued, my tone light, almost conversational. "The embezzlement, the insurance fraud, the falsified patient records. You really thought no one would find out?" The murmur of the guests grew louder, shock rippling through the room like a slow-building storm. My father's lips parted, but no words came out. My mother's grip on her glass tightened, her knuckles turning white. I pulled another neatly folded document from my clutch and held it up between my fingers. "Bank statements," I said casually. "Emails. Legal records. All tying the Moore family clinic to multiple counts of financial fraud." Dr. Peterson, the hospital director, who had been standing near the back of the room, stiffened. I turned to him, locking eyes. "Dr. Peterson," I called out, my voice slicing through the murmurs, "I think you'd like to know that Elle isn't actually a doctor." The room collectively gasped. Dr. Peterson, a distinguished-looking man with silver hair and a carefully maintained composure, narrowed his eyes. His gaze flickered between me and my father. "What?"
His voice was sharp.
"That's impossible." I arched a brow. "Is it?" He turned to my father, his face darkening. "You told me she had a degree." My father's mouth opened and closed uselessly. He looked like a man scrambling for an escape route that didn't exist. Dr. Peterson's expression turned ice cold. "Do you have any idea what this means? The liability this puts on the hospital? We've been allowing her to consult patients based on your word that she was qualified." Elle spun toward my father, her panic breaking through. "Dad, say something," she hissed. But he couldn't, because there was nothing to say. The whispers around the room escalated into a full-blown murmur of scandal. Guests began inching away from my family, as if their corruption was something they could physically avoid. Dr. Peterson took a slow, measured breath before turning toward his assistant. "Call the legal department," he ordered. My father blanched. "Wait, this isn't what it looks like." "Oh," I said, tilting my head, "because it looks like you've been committing fraud for years. And now you've been caught." Elle turned on me, her eyes burning with fury. "You bitch," she spat. I merely smiled. "Language, Elle. You wouldn't want to ruin your perfect image any further, would you?" Ron, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was eerily calm, but his hands were clenched at his sides. "So it's true?" he asked, his gaze locked on Elle. "You lied about everything?" Elle looked at him, her expression desperate. "Ron, He held up a hand. "Don't. Just don't." And then, with a quiet finality, he pulled off his wedding ring and dropped it onto the marble floor. Elle inhaled sharply as the small band clinked against the ground, the sound echoing louder than it should have in the heavy silence. The wedding, the illusion of perfection, was crumbling. And I was just getting started. The chaos in the ballroom had reached its peak, the weight of every exposed lie pressing down on my family like a collapsing house of cards. Elle was crumbling, Ron was gone, and my father, once so confident, so untouchable, stood stiff, his face drained of all color. But I wasn't done. Not yet. I reached into my clutch one last time, pulling out a final document, thicker than the others, stamped with an official government seal. I unfolded it carefully, taking my time as I let my gaze sweep over my father, my mother, and Elle, ensuring they felt every second of the impending blow. "You know," I mused, my voice carrying through the stunned silence, "I thought I had uncovered everything. But imagine my surprise when I ran an identity check recently." I held up the paper, tilting it just enough for the nearest guess to catch a glimpse of the IRS letterhead. Turns out, someone's been using my social security number for years. My father stiffened. I smirked. Care to guess who? My mother inhaled sharply, her fingers tightening around her champagne glass. Elle, still on the floor, looked up, dazed, as if trying to process what was happening. But my father, he knew. I have proof, I continued. Tax fraud, money laundering, a long, beautiful trail of financial crimes all conveniently tied to your clinic. I tilted my head. Did you really think the IRS wouldn't notice? He snapped. You think you're better than us? His voice was sharp, venomous, desperate. I let out a cold laugh, taking a slow step toward him. I don't have to think it, I said, my voice steady, unwavering. I know it. A murmur rippled through the guests, followed by gasps as Dr. Peterson, the hospital director, took a step forward. His expression was tight with barely restrained fury. This is beyond a scandal, he said, his tone clipped. He turned to his assistant. Call legal. Now. My father took a step back. We can fix this. No, Dr. Peterson cut him off. You can't. He glanced at security, who had already moved in. Get them out of here. The guards wasted no time. They grabbed my father's arms, ignoring his protests, and as he struggled, I saw it, the raw panic in his eyes. The reality setting in. You have no idea what you've done, he spat at me as they dragged him toward the exit. I smiled. Oh, I think I do. My mother, silent for the first time all night, followed, her face eerily blank. It was over, and she knew it. Elle remained where she was, her perfect image shattered. She sobbed into her hands, broken, humiliated. I watched as they were led away, as their world collapsed under the weight of their own deception. And for the first time in years, I felt truly, completely free. The ballroom was in ruins, not physically, but in the way that mattered most. The perfect, polished image my family had carefully crafted over the years had been shattered beyond repair. The murmurs of the guests turned into outright whispers, their polite smiles replaced with scandalized fascination. My father was gone, dragged out by security, his voice still echoing in my ears, empty threats from a man who had finally lost everything. My mother had followed in silence, knowing there was nothing left to salvage. And Elle was still on the floor, sobbing into her hands, surrounded by the wreckage of the life she had so desperately tried to maintain. And me? I didn't stay to gloat. I didn't need to. I had already won. I turned away, my black gown flowing behind me as I walked toward the exit. My heels clicked against the marble floor, but this time, the sound wasn't an announcement. It was a conclusion. Adam was already waiting for me by the doors, his expression unreadable, but I could see it in his eyes. Pride. Amusement. Understanding. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't need to. He knew the answer. Instead, he tilted his head slightly and, in the most casual voice imaginable, asked, "So, cake?" I blinked, startled. And then laughter. Not the polite, restrained kind. Not the bitter, hollow laughter I had learned to perfect over the years. Real, genuine, free laughter. The kind that came from deep within. The kind I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. I shook my head, still grinning as I reached for his hand. Yes, I said, breathless, still laughing. Let's get some cake. Because revenge had never been the goal. It had never been about making them suffer. It had never been about proving anything to them. It was about me. It was about walking away without looking back. About knowing that I had built something greater than they ever could, without their approval, without their support, without needing them at all. It was about stepping into the rest of my life, completely unburdened. And for the first time in 14 years, I felt it. Freedom.